Hello world, I'm Nick, software developer and .NET enthusiast, and in this video I'm going to talk about how you can export data from a database in SQL to Excel using C#. We're going to use a lot of examples of Blazor and Entity Framework and some special libraries, or one special library that can actually turn a data table into an Excel spreadsheet. But before we get into that, don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel for more great .NET content. It's a super massive help, good English, and yeah, it would be really great if you could do that. So if you haven't already subscribed, hit that button. So that's the YouTube spiel out of the way. Let's get into actually learning how to take some data from a database through Blazor to a spreadsheet. So what am I using for this demo? Well, there's a few technologies that you need to be familiar with, and I've done some other videos on Blazor specifically and Entity Framework, so please do check those out if you want some more in-depth background on Blazor and Entity Framework specifically. But for this video, I'm going to assume that you've got some initial experience, or you can at least create a Blazor project, in particular server-side Blazor in Visual Studio, or in my case, JetBrains Rider. Now for my Entity Framework project, I've used a sample database from Microsoft called AdventureWorks, and I'll put a link to where you can download that in the description below. But essentially it's a database which represents a fake company, and for the purposes of this demo I'm going to be pulling data from the products table. So I'll give you a little bit of a tour of my project. As you can see here, it's a little bit messy, but essentially all my models that have come from Entity Framework are listed out here. And I've got my general DB001 context. So that's the context for my database where I've added the AdventureWorks data. I've got the usual Blazor pages that come with the sample application, but for the purposes of my demo, I've changed the fetchdata.razor page, which in the original Blazor tutorial, it's actually, or the sample application, it does a fetch for weather information. For this, I've changed it so that it will tap into my Entity Framework context and it will pull through a list of all the products in the database. So as you can see here at the top of the Blazor page, we've got this injection. So we're injecting that context that I've set up. That's our dependency injection. And then from that, I'm able to render the data into the table. So using the onInitialized async method that we're overriding, we're able to set a collection to be equal to the products that are in the database. So that will happen when the page loads, and then as part of the Razor code that we've got above, we're putting that into the table, so we're just showing the data. So if I run this, I'll just kickstart the Blazor application, and I'll head over to that fetch data page, and you should see that we get all that data. There's not much of it, so I'm not worried too much about trying to page it or anything like that, but simply we've got some data on a page, and for this we can then say, okay, I want to export this to Excel. How do I do that? Now you might be thinking, well, how often am I going to need to export things to Excel? Do I even need to learn this stuff? Well, it's not necessarily just about the Excel part. As part of this, you'll learn about things like data tables, streams, and also specifically for Blazor, we'll also talk about how you can download pages that you're serving from within your application and also call into JavaScript from Blazor. So that's something that I haven't touched on in any of my previous Blazor videos. I've usually marketed Blazor as this thing which is ultra C# for single page applications, but actually for use cases like this, it's pretty necessary for us to cross that threshold into the world of JavaScript. And I'm going to show you how you can do that as part of this exporting activity. So first things first, we need to get the data, and then we need to turn that into a spreadsheet, and then somehow serve it from our page so that it can be downloaded. But how are we going to turn it into Excel? Or how are we going to turn it into a spreadsheet? Well, this is where we're going to use an open source library, and I want to give a really big shout out to the authors of ClosedXML. As you can see here on the screen, on GitHub, it's a .NET library for reading, manipulating, and writing Excel files. Now, you've got lots of options when it comes to using, when it comes to manipulating data and turning it into a spreadsheet. I've done quite a lot of work on sort of desktop applications with Microsoft's Interop systems, but for web, it's a little bit more difficult, and I think libraries like ClosedXML are fantastic because they offer a really easy interface for converting data from places like SQL or even from an API into binary which can be read into an Excel spreadsheet. What you're going to want to do if you want to follow along with this is head over to the ClosedXML repo, or you can get it on NuGet. I would actually advise maybe going over to NuGet, but the documentation for ClosedXML is really good. Please do take a look at their READMEs. Give them a star on GitHub. It's a fantastic library. I've been able to use it at work for production scenarios. I've got a lot of trust in it, so yeah, check it out. So assuming you've gone back to your Blazor project and you've installed ClosedXML via NuGet, then we can get started. So you can see here at the top, I've got a using statement for closedxml.xl, and I've also started to put together a routine, a function that will create the product bytes. So by that, what I'm saying is I want to take the data from the database, so the lines and columns which represent those products that we're showing on the screen, and I want to turn them into the bytes that I could save as an Excel spreadsheet. So that's why I've created this byte array function called products to bytes. I've also created a void method here called export to Excel, and that will be starting by calling products to bytes. So the idea here is that eventually, once we've got the backend functionality working and we're converting the data over to bytes, I'll set a click handler on a button on the front end which will call this export to Excel method, and it will then go away and build the data, and then the second part of it will be where we actually serve it so it can be downloaded. So let's make a start on this products to bytes function then. So there are two things that we need to create in order to get started. The first one will be a workbook instance. So this is an instance of the ClosedXML's workbook object. So I'm going to say var, using var XML work, well actually I'll just call it workbook. Excel workbook, there we go. So that's the object that I want to create. So this is the ClosedXML.Excel workbook object. And then on top of that also I want to create a new data table. So I'm going to say var data table equals new data table. There we go. So the idea here is that we first create that workbook that we're going to essentially turn into the spreadsheet, and then we create a data table which can hold our data to then be transferred or converted into a format which can be rendered as an Excel spreadsheet. So let's start by building the data table, and whenever we're building a data table we want to create our columns, don't we? So if we look at our products, we can see in the table we've got 4 columns. We've got name, we've got weight, product number, and list price. So I'm just going to mimic these. I'm going to say, let's create the columns in the data table. So data table dot columns dot add new data column, and we'll call that name. There we go. We've got weight. We've got product number. And then we've got list price. So we've created a data table which has the same columns as our HTML table. The next thing we're going to want to do is iterate through the product object that we've got currently in memory on our Blazor page, and then we're going to create a new row for each of those products. So we'll go to products.forEach, and we'll use a lambda expressions. So we're iterating over each of our products. So we'll add a new row first. So we'll say our new row equals data table, and we can call the new row method or function on that will return a new row for us, and then we can just build up the columns in the row with the data from the product. We can say new row and then name is equal to X, which is the current product, dot name. There you go. We keep building this up until we've got all the columns covered. So weight is equal to X dot weight. 2 more left. Product number is equal to X dot product product number. That's right. In fact, actually, I've confused myself a little bit there, because in the table I'm actually using product ID for the product number. So probably not the best practice, but glad I caught that. So there we go, product ID. And then the last one was list price, which we're using list price for. So list price equals x dot list price. Okay, so because we've created these columns on the data table, the row's already expecting that we can just target those columns. So as long as those columns exist, we can add that data to the column of that row. So there's our data table, in theory, populated with data. The next thing we then need to do is to take the data table and insert the data into the workbook. Now, as you probably know, you don't necessarily have to be an Excel expert to know this, but workbooks are made up of worksheets. So first of all, we're going to have to create a worksheet. But as part of adding the worksheet, we'll fill it with data, and we can do that by passing in the data table. The add method, or the add function, will accept a parameter of type data table. So let's say var worksheet equals workbook dot sheets, worksheets dot add, and then with this you can see we can actually pass in various different parameters, but for our purposes we're going to pass in a data table. So we'll pass in data table. So now in order to turn this data table into a byte array, I'm going to use a memory stream. So I'll say using var memory stream equals new memory stream. What this will allow us to do is say workbook, so the entire workbook that contains the sheet we just created, dot save as, and that accepts a stream. So we can pass in the memory stream, and that will save the workbook into that stream. And then we can say return memory stream dot to array. That will give us the bytes that we want. So now that we have those bytes, they're sitting in this spreadsheet bytes variable, we can now save these somewhere as an Excel file. Because we have the binary data, we can say, let's take that binary data and save it to a file system. In this case, the web server hosting the Blazor application. Now, what specific directory do we want to save it to? Now, if we were going to allow this to be downloaded from the Blazor app, we can actually save it within the www root. Now, what I'm going to do is create a new folder called exports. And this is going to be where any of the exported spreadsheets go. I'm going to create a new method which is going to save spreadsheet bytes, and that will expect to receive a byte array called bytes. So what I'll do is then use the system.io namespace to do file.write all bytes and then bytes. Now that expects a path first, so I can leave the bytes in there, but first specify the actual path. And for this, I want to say it's at the root, then it's www root exports, and then I can give it a name. So I'm going to call it export.xlsx for Excel file. And then I can call that as part of export to Excel. So I'll say save spreadsheet bytes, spreadsheet bytes. There we go. So we're creating the byte array for the data using the ClosedXML library. Then we're doing the saving of that to this exports folder in the www root folder, and that should then allow us to then serve that file for download. Now it's the download bit that actually requires that JavaScript interop. So let's take a look at that. Now here I am over at the ASP.NET Core documentation specifically for Blazor, and this document talks about Blazor file downloads. So there are lots of different options that you can use to download files using an ASP.NET application, and largely it depends on the size of the file. Now for our file, it's not very large, so you could potentially download it from a stream, but that would be typically files under 250 meg, and we want to kind of future-proof it in case there were larger files. So we're not going to use this method. Instead, I'm going to use this download from URL method, and this is the one that we've just set up, where we're going to store the file in the www root and then another folder inside that. Now we've already taken care of saving that binary data as a file in that directory, but now what we need to do is to be able to trigger the actual download, and this is where the JavaScript Interop comes in. And so you can see here we've got a script that Microsoft reference, and this is just JavaScript. So this script will actually trigger the download that we want to happen when that person clicks the button. So because this is Blazor, and we have to do this JavaScript interrupt, what you have to do, as shown in this example here, is use dependency injection to inject the IJS runtime, and that is what allows you to do this JavaScript interrupt. It allows you to call the JavaScript from C#. So I'm just going to copy that line, and I'm going to go back into our component. I'm just going to drop that into here, so I'm able to make the call from this page. Further down in the example, you can see that the example page has a button with a click event, which is pointing to this task here, this download file from URL. And really all that's doing is calling over the interop. It's invoking a void method called trigger file download, which, as you can see, is this script here. We would simply change the file name to be the one we're expecting, so export.xlsx, and then the URL would be the local host with the port we're using, the exports folder, and then the export file name. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy this, and then for our purposes we can alter that. So I'll drop that down here, and we'll change that over to export.xlsx. And obviously, you know, if you were using this in production, you would potentially pass through a file name. The user might type in the name for the report. You can control all those idiosyncrasies later. So obviously this URL is not going to be correct because it's a different port. So I've put in the Blazor port that we're using, and I also need to change the folder to exports and then the file name to exports or export.xlsx. And so then we're able to then invoke that trigger file download using those two variables. But I actually can't invoke that yet because that script doesn't exist on this Blazor application. So let's copy that script. I go over to documentation and just copy out this script that we referenced. What I'm going to have to do is actually put it into a static place where it can be accessed, and that's unfortunately not an eraser page. So I'm going to put it in the host file because it's a CSHTML page, and I should be able to just drop it in here. So that means I should be then able to call this from my C# fetchData.razor component page. So it's going to be kind of different in the sense that the button isn't going to directly call the download. Instead, the button is going to trigger everything else that we've just created, like taking the data and putting it into bytes that can be saved as a spreadsheet, saving it as a spreadsheet in that www root folder, and then doing the download. So it'll be then called download file from URL. And also here in the example, we've also got a HTML button. So I'm just going to copy that for speed. I'm going to put that just below that paragraph before the table. I'm going to change its label and say it's actually export. So let's just change that click handler. So export to Excel, and then try running it. So go over to fetch data. There's the page, click export. So it failed again. So let's take a look at what the reason for that might be. We can see there is an exception here, and I think it's possibly because I've actually forgotten to add the new rows to the data table every time I create them. So actually, if I put in here data table dot add or rows dot add new row, then we should have actual data to place inside the worksheet. So as well as that exception, I also found that I'd missed adding a name for the sheet that I was adding to the workbook. So I've also just said here that the sheet name for it is products. So that should work for us. So let's run that. So fetch data and then click export. And there we go. We've got a download. Let's open that up. And here we go. So this is the product data that was shown on our screen before, and that's been pulled out of our database via Entity Framework. And as you can see, the ClosedXML library has automatically added filters for us. So if we wanted to, we could say, I just want to see everything that is a cable lock. And there's one item there, and it's product number 843. So straight away, this gives you a really nice and simple way, apart from the first two attempts where I messed things up a little bit, to export data from your database. I've actually implemented this in Azure Functions as well. So it's using a HTTP function. My application calls that when the user wants to export some data, and it's asynchronous, so the data gets populated elsewhere for the user to pick up in case it's a large data set. And I'm using the same library, and it's working extremely well. So I think this could work extremely well for you in your use cases, and give it a try. Let me know how it goes. I hope this was really useful, and for more .NET content like this, then please do join me again, and I look forward to seeing you.